So we are all subject to denial about some things. When it comes to character traits, some of us tend to be in denial of our weaknesses, and some of us may even lean toward denial of our strengths. Sometimes we're in denial of a health problem, so we may avoid going to the doctor to get things checked out. We may even delay dealing with it for so long that the problem gets worse, so it may even be too late by the time we have it checked out. Denial can be a dangerous thing to our physical well-being. For the Pharisees and Sadducees that we looked at last week at the beginning of Matthew 16, denial threatened their spiritual well-being. As long as they remained in denial, they had no hope for a right relationship with God. They were denying that the one person who provided hope for all people, they denied that he was even from God. Now we come to Jesus' inner circle of chosen followers, and we find that they are not immune to the disease of denial. In their case, it will come from a very different place than it did for the Pharisees and Sadducees, however. It will start with the opposite response to Jesus. It starts with them putting their hope in him, as they should. But the problem is not that they fail to place their hope in Jesus. The problem is in what they are hoping for. So as is often the case, Peter is the one who is the mouthpiece for their misunderstanding. So let's begin at Matthew 16, verse 13, where Jesus asks for a sort of progress report. When Jesus came to the area of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his followers, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They answered, "Some say you are John the Baptist. Others say you are Elijah, and still others that you are Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Then Jesus asked them, "And who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered, "You are blessed, Simon, son of Jonah, because no person taught you that. My Father in heaven showed you who I am. So I tell you, you are Peter. On this rock I will build my church, and the power of death will not be able to defeat it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. The things you don't allow on earth will be the things that God does not allow, and the things you allow on earth will be the things that God allows." Then Jesus warned his followers not to tell anyone he was the Christ. So, after Jesus has turned away a potential army of 5,000 men, those men that he fed, and he began to avoid the attention of Herod and the Jewish leaders by going to Gentile areas, as we saw last week, Jesus asks his inner circle what people are now thinking and saying about his identity, who he is. Well, his question is not about people like those Jewish religious leaders whose denial has just been exposed. He's asking about the common people. He's essentially saying, so we know what the religious establishment types are thinking. Who do the people, or what do the people think? The significant thing is, in the answer is that what they are not saying. That is, what the people are not saying. Unlike the Pharisees and Sadducees, who are in denial of the obvious, undeniable starting point, the people do know that Jesus is from God. Unlike those religious leaders, they're denying that he's from God. But the people know he's from God. So they're saying, now, John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets, all men sent by God. But what they are no longer saying is that he is the Christ. The people had hoped that he would lead them in conquest against the Romans. They had wanted to make him that kind of king, but he turned them away. So Jesus asks his inner circle, where they are in all of this. Who do you say I am? And it's Peter who gives that really good answer. But he takes it a step beyond, even beyond what has generally been said by those who are making statements of faith in him. Peter says, "You are the Christ." A lot of people had thought that might be true, at least in the past. But Peter adds, the Son of the living God. That may sound normal to us, but that has actually only been said once, as Matthew has told the story, by any followers or admirers of Jesus. And that was not long before this, when he had come out to his disciples walking on the water, and he rescued Peter from his own weak faith. And, when Peter started to sink, and when they got into the boat, they said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." But Jesus usually called himself the Son of Man. Several times he had been called Son of David by those who wanted to be healed. But guess who were the only ones who had actually called him Son of God before this? God the Father called him his Son after he was baptized. Then the devil challenged him, saying, "If you are the Son of God, then turn these stones to bread. If you are the Son of God, then jump down and let the angels catch you." And then some demons in the Gentile region of Gadara yelled out, "What do you want with us, Son of God?" So we have to give Peter and the disciples credit for a faith that was increasing rather than weakening. And Jesus certainly does give credit. However, there is still a problem, not so much with their faith as with their hope. This is what leads him to tell them not to tell anyone that he is the Christ. If it is one thing to know who Jesus is, but another to know his purpose. So let's read on and see what is the problem with Peter's hope. From that time on, Jesus began telling his followers that he must go to Jerusalem, where the Jewish elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of the law would make him suffer many things. He told them he must be killed and then be raised from the dead on the third day. Peter took Jesus aside and told him not to talk like that. He said, "God save you from those things. Those things must never happen to you." Then Jesus said to Peter, "Go away from me, Satan. You're not helping me. You don't care about the things of God, but only about the things people think are important." Then Jesus said to his followers, "If people want to follow me, they must give up the things they want. They must be willing even to give up their lives to follow me. Those who want to save their lives will give up true life, and those who give up their lives for me will have true life. It is worthless to have the whole world if they lose their souls. They could never pay enough to buy back their souls." So, according to Peter, Jesus is the Son of the living God, but he's got it all wrong when he says that he must be killed and then be raised from the dead. And according to Jesus, Peter is blessed, but he's Satan. The problem occurs because Peter knows the truth, but he is in denial. Partly in denial of the facts, but partly in denial of the meaning or implications of those facts. I think we can all appreciate why Peter would not want Jesus to suffer and die. But has he been paying attention to how the Jewish leaders have been responding to Jesus all along? And is he really paying attention when Jesus says he will be raised from the dead? Peter's hope, what Peter hopes in is the problem. He's hoping for the wrong outcome. Again, he's thinking too small. He's still hoping for that Jewish kingdom, like David's kingdom, that rules over all of the world in a political sense, but doesn't really rule over all of mankind. I think Jesus is referring first to himself when he says, "What good would it be to rule the whole world if I were bowing down to Satan in order to achieve that? I would be trading my soul for that prize." Well, where do I get the idea that he's referring to himself first? Well, go back to Matthew 4 when the devil is tempting Jesus in the desert. The devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all of the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan. For it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Have we heard that language somewhere? Well, the devil left him, and the angels came and attended him. He had been fasting for 40 days, so he needed a little help. But Luke says the devil left him until an opportune time. So Satan returns in the passage today in the form of Peter at this opportune time to tempt him again with basically the same temptation. I was a little shocked when one of my college professors at Harding, a school known for its conservative political leanings, said that the most efficient form of government is a benevolent dictatorship. I would add the word wise to that, but then it is true. A wise and benevolent dictatorship doesn't have to deal with all of the nonsense that a democratic government has to deal with. Now, the wise and benevolent dictator knows that, he knows what is right and he has the best interests of the people in his or her heart, but there isn't any argument, there isn't any twisting everything around to get it done. That's what a good king is, a wise and benevolent dictator. So think about this. Do you think Jesus would have been a wise and benevolent king? Do you think people would have been better off with Jesus ruling the world? So was Jesus tempted to think that ruling the world was maybe a better idea than dying on the cross with the sins of the world on his shoulders? Well, from a human perspective, of course, that would be at least tempting. Of course, you might think that would be a better option. And that's why he tells Peter that he has gone to the dark side. He's making Satan's argument for Satan. You're not helping me, he says to Peter. You don't care about the things of God, but only about the things people think are important. Just when it seems like you understand and you endorse the priorities of my upside-down kingdom, where the king lives to serve the people, you fall back to advocate that right-side-up kingdom where the people live to serve the king. The strong use their strength to serve themselves, and the weak are used for the pleasure of the strong. Well, that's tempting, Peter, but you already have that in this world. I could rule the world in that way, but it would cost me my own soul. Why would you hope for that? Now, this does not only apply to Jesus. We have to choose between the priorities of the world and those of God. We can choose to use our God-given talents and energies for our own benefit and use people to raise ourselves up, or we can use our spiritual gifts to serve spiritual priorities. Now that means serving the weak and helpless and the smelly and unpleasant and the annoying and rude and the foolish and undeserving people. And you think I'm talking about the homeless and the addicts and other criminals, don't you? Well, I'm actually starting with babies. I mean, all of those words describe babies, weak and helpless and smelly and unpleasant and annoying and rude and foolish and undeserving. Well, we can usually love those babies and serve them at the drop of a hat, but when they don't grow out of those things, we can't seem to see them as God sees us. We are all of those things at times. And Peter had slipped back into being one of those annoying and foolish children. And then Jesus says, not only do I have to die on the cross, so do you, Peter. And so does anyone who is truly my follower. But there's good news to follow this bad news. The Son of Man will come again with his Father's glory and with his angels, and at that time he will reward them for what they have done. I tell you the truth, some people standing here will see the Son of Man coming with his kingdom before they die. Now, people today still have a problem with the term kingdom, just as the first followers of Jesus did. We hear the term and we think of a government or a country or at least some kind of institution instead of a state of submission to a king. The Son of Man reigns supreme within and over every government and every power figure that exists and has ever existed or will ever exist. Remember Jesus' parable of the yeast back in chapter 13. The kingdom is like yeast. Jesus warns about, in the last passage, the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, as we saw last week, but he had used the nature of yeast to describe the kingdom of God earlier. Just as the yeast of those teachers could work its way through the dough and ruin it all, Jesus had already compared the influence of the kingdom in the same way, only it could work its way through the yeast to make it good. The reign of Christ spreads and permeates everything around it, beginning in our hearts, working its way through our entire being and on out into everything that we touch. It cannot and will not be overthrown by any outside force, no matter how vicious those forces may be. It can only be defeated from within when we allow it to be overruled by our own will. That will never happen, though, on a wholesale basis. God will not allow that ever to happen in such a way that Jesus' kingdom does not still rule. His rule is spiritual, and in the spiritual realm, it will always reign supreme. The reason the disciples continued to be in denial of what he said about what was going to happen to him it sort of had two prongs. One was a weak faith in the part where he said he would be raised from the dead. It was almost as if he never said that even after it was fulfilled. They just couldn't seem to hear it. The other problem was, I would say, a bigger problem because it involved their motives and their desires. They wanted to be his advisors and generals and cabinet members in a visibly powerful and prestigious government. So they actually remained in denial of what he said about the kingdom up to the point when he ascended to be seated on the throne of heaven in Acts chapter 2. They said, "Are you at this time finally going to restore the kingdom?" Well, they thought that a kingdom like that was the best news that they could ever hope for. The kingdom like David's kingdom. But the reality was actually much better news for them. And it is much better news for us. The language about the kingdom in this last sentence is a little awkward. Almost every English translation says he will come in his kingdom. That not much more clear than saying he will come with his kingdom in the New Century Version that we read. But it's a little awkward to fit the picture of Jesus coming with the glory of the Father and his angels into the invisible kingdom that we are in. I think that they may be two different things. The coming of Jesus with the angels being one, and the coming in or with his kingdom being the other. I'm sorry I can't clear this up, but don't let it distract us from the bottom line. The bottom line is that we are giving up our lives for others as Jesus gave up his life for us, but we will share in his glory in the same way at some point, and that glory will not end or be limited in any way. So here's what we need to embrace and never deny. Two things. First of all, we must embrace the fact that we must be crucified or will be crucified with him. The example of Kent Brantley illustrates what this can mean. You may remember his story from a long time before our current pandemic, when there was not a pandemic but an epidemic of cases of the Ebola virus in West Africa. It was not as widespread, but it was more vicious even than the coronavirus. So Dr. Kent Brantley was a medical missionary who found himself serving patients in Liberia who were dying by the hundreds, and then he contracted the virus himself. And when he did that, one of the missionary nurses with him did also, Nancy Wright-Bowl, and one of the more hopeful treatments at first was similar to the plasma treatments for COVID. There was blood from a patient who had recovered from the virus, and so they had only enough for one person, and so initially Kent insisted that Nancy Wright-Bowl should have the first infusion of that treatment. And then when they were both eventually airlifted to Emory University in Atlanta to receive a treatment that had only been used on monkeys, Kent was first to be the guinea pig to receive that drug. Well, he did recover, and so did Nancy Wright-Bowl, and we did not have a big outbreak in the U.S. as was feared. Some didn't even want them to be allowed to come back into the U.S. And this is an interview on PBS after Kent and his wife had written a book on their experience.